Welcome to the Churchill Club's 14th annual Top 10 Tech Trends event. We're co-presented with Forbes. My name's Avery Lyford. I'm thrilled to see you all here. I'm proud to be the chairman of the Churchill Club this year. This year, and for the 14 previous years, I'm happy to see some of the smartest people in Silicon Valley here tonight. I'd also like to say hello to all of our Fora TV live stream viewers. Since Fora is live streaming this event, feel free to put out on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter links to Fora TV so your friends can join the event with you. The Churchill Club is proud to co-present this with Forbes. With their Midas list, which recently came out, this is their carefully considered list of the top venture capitalists in the world. All 5 of our speakers are on that list, and 4 of them are in the top 15. And a few of them had a very good week last week. So let's welcome and bring up our distinguished speakers. First of all, Kevin Efrusy of Accel Partners. Bing Gordon of Kleiner Perkins. Reid Hoffman of Greylock. Steve Jurvetson of Draper Fisher and Jurvetson. And Peter Thiel of Clarium Capital. Welcome and thank you all for being here. Now let's get our EMCs up on stage. Please welcome Bruce Upbin and Eric Savitz of Forbes.
Thanks, Avery. I've just brought the average net worth down of the on stage here, so thanks for that. We're really excited to be here, partnering with the Churchill Club in an amazing event, amazing organization, actually founded by our own Rich Carlgard, Tony Perkins, many years ago. It's a phenomenal organization, and this is a terrific annual event. Also want to thank Todd Irwin for introducing or suggesting the collaboration between Forbes and Churchill, and Karen Tucker for inviting us and making it happen. I'm really looking forward to hearing what these guys are going to say.
So I hope you're ready for a night of provocative trends. Forbes is proud to partner with the Churchill Club. Churchill Club's been around for a quarter of a century, embedded in the culture of Silicon Valley. I'm pretty stoked to be here myself. But before we get to the trends, we have a surprise announcement. We've called you all here under false pretenses. You're stealing my punchline. Yes, tonight I'm going to announce, I'm proud to announce, Bruce and I are getting married. I designed the ring myself.
However, we had to cut our honeymoon short.
What happened?
We put all our money, I put the money, honey, in the Facebook IPO. Sorry about that.
Next year, we're going to get married. Okay. Thanks for coming to the wedding. So we're ready to hear some trends. So the basic rules here, what we asked our panelists to do is to provide a trend that is not obvious today, and there will be huge growth over the next 5 years. So we're trying to look down into the future.
Right. So here's what happens. So Eric and I will give you a brief description of the trend, one at a time. And then the owner of the trend will get 2.5 minutes to explain it and persuade everybody in the room that their trend is the top trend. The panel will then vote and comment for a few minutes, and the audience will vote, and we'll see where we end up at the end of the whole thing. So Eric, honey, I just love saying that.
Babe.
Take it away.
Okay. The first trend is from Kevin, and the trend is called Radical Globalization of Social Commerce. And it reads as follows. In prior cycles, international segments consisted of 30 to 40% of revenue, beginning 3 to 5 years after the US effort. Going forward, ROW, which is rest of the world, can dominate domestic. And players who wait to address the rest of the world are going to be vulnerable to their competitors who go global first. Kevin?
Okay. I just thought I'd start by, I'm trying to read a few facts here off my iPhone. When Amazon went public, I believe it was in 1997, through December of 96, their revenue outside the US was about 33%. And that was sort of one of the larger ones of the IPOs of the day. eBay, when they went public, I'm reading here what they have. The company has introduced country-specific homepages in Canada, the United Kingdom, and a joint venture with a subsidiary in Australia and New Zealand. Though we believe they didn't report segment revenue. Yahoo, it was 1% of revenue, and for Google, it was 26%. So contrast that with Groupon. When they went public late last year, they were in approximately 50 countries, and the international segment revenue was over half, almost 60% of their business. The other thing I'd sort of highlight, which is kind of an interesting fact that you don't hear discussed a lot, is that of the top 15 internet companies today by market cap, 7 of them are based outside of the United States. And this does not include Skype, that was bought for $8 billion by Microsoft. And it counts Priceline as a US company, when in fact most of Priceline's recent appreciation in market cap comes from their acquisition of Bookings.com, which is based in the Netherlands. So the point is that the rest of the world, particularly some of the emerging BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, are much, much more important than they were in the last cycle. And that just, if you want to be the leading global player, just dominating the US might not be enough. And if one of your competitors, whether they're US-based or elsewhere, is the first to pull together the important countries of the rest of the world, they might end up being more important than you are. So whereas before the strategy was win the US, wait till year 4 or 5, and then maybe you go to the UK or France and open up an office, now we're advising a lot of our companies to do that in month 12, 14, 18, or even sooner. And you're seeing a lot of companies focus on that a lot sooner to make sure that they can be the ones to dominate their market around the world and not someone else.
With 10 seconds to spare.
That's it.
Nice. Panel? So the way this works, right? Green panel. Green is we agree. Red is we don't agree.
But I presume
if you wave it around in this way, like wishy-washy style.
But it's commentary.
No wishy-washy.
We're going to vote and then commentary.
Oh, vote then comment?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So we're going to vote now.
So we don't affect each other.
Okay.
And the audience can vote anytime during this process. But panel, what's your balance?
Green, 2 greens.
2 greens.
Bing's getting his paddle out.
Come on, Bing.
Come on.
Hey, Dave, don't go too soon. Let those Chinese copy your stuff first. Sooner than you want, but way longer than it sounds from the panel.
Well, I actually think so. I do think the trend is there. I think Groupon's example, another company that we've invested in, Wrap, is actually already pursuing multiple countries. I think the counterpoint is the U.S. is still the most important market. And so the question comes down to when you're looking at it, and you have to choose winning the U.S. really matters. And so hence the, yes, you should do other things, but make sure you win the U.S.
Yeah, just be there a day before the Samblers.
I agree with the trend, but I find it uninteresting. So I'm not sure.
That's the upside down.
So I'm exactly the same.
You just hold the wooden part up.
I prefer the word obvious
and
rather
so
than interesting.
It's
okay.
uninteresting because if you have a company that be copied by the Samwer brothers or 100 other people overnight, it has no value. It's basically a world in which there are many people who can do the same thing is one where everything is in perfect competition and it has no real value. And so the fact that you have to move so quickly suggests that you don't have much of a technological lead or anything else of the sort.
This is funny, because I have the same conclusion, but for the opposite reason, because I disagree with everything Peter said, but have the same conclusion, which is that this is so true and so right, but it's 12 years old. It was the trend to say in 2000 Right? So
I don't think people
Hotmail
acted
was
on it in
primarily
2000.
outside the U.S., over 60%. Skype was primarily outside the U.S. in the early 2000s. After that, every one of these companies, more recently Tango and others, so communication products started there. So the part of your trend I really like, and I think is important, is that social commerce hasn't gone international yet, and startups have to focus on that. In terms of social networking, Orkut, as we all know, early experiment, that's been proven. If you let the cat out of the bag, it will spread like crazy over there. So I think both, for the opportunity that's there, unlike what I think I just heard, and the imperative, I just think it's what every startup in consumer internet businesses has been doing for the last decade, has been go global from the beginning. Don't ignore the global market. That is very different from 1995. The trend occurred in the last 90s, though, in the late 90s, and by 2000 2009, that was the what's your China strategy? What's your everyone joked about in the venture circles, right?
Yeah. Well, another way to ask the question is, what year after founding do you think a company should get 50% of its traffic or revenues
Day
outside
one.
of North America?
So Tango, Skype, Hotmail, day one they were over 50% because they're viral global products.
Helps if you start in Scandinavia.
Yeah, Skype is already.
Or Fremont, in the case of Hotmail.
And the other thing in terms of an investing perspective is if you actually invest in the ones that have network effects like Airbnb, even when you have the Samwares try to copy them at a fast basis, it basically doesn't go anywhere. Right? So if it's isolated to each country itself, like a little bit like what Groupon was doing, then it's really important you get there because it's this country only.
That's why it was called social commerce.
Yes,
Because
exactly.
in certain categories, Facebook, others, but that's why it was sort of specifically.
I guess I will modify my criticism. There's probably a small in-between category of companies that are really valuable and where if you move quickly enough, you can capture value because you'll be able to get there before all the copycats get there. Most companies, you don't want to have something where it's so easy for people to copy.
Great example is Baidu. More searches in China today than Google in the United States.
But so the interesting thing that when you talk about Baidu, this rule doesn't apply in reverse. This is a one-way rule, right? So Baidu doesn't. Why doesn't Baidu have to do business in? So you don't have to do business in the U.S. if you're in China.
Oh, that's a
in the
tricky
US,
question.
you have to do
China and search is a little bit of a tricky case.
Is anybody telling Baidu, your crummy company, 50% of your revenue isn't outside China?
It's a special case.
Well, why? What's so special about
Language
it?
specific search.
They got a protected
it's not a
market
communications
that's pretty good.
So the analogies I gave on why things go global is a communications product. If you're localized, either because you have a local business like Groupon or Yelp or something, you've got to get over. There's 20 Groupon clones in Japan alone.
So it's the China exception rule. So you have to go global right away unless you're in China, in which case you can just stay in China.
No, we can't do it with democracy. Why do we can do it with startups?
That almost sounds profound.
Okay. Well, it's time for the audience to vote. So you've got green and red paper, Christmassy looking paper on your tables. So we want to see green if you think globalization is the way you got to go, red if you think no.
Who's counting the cards? You counting the cards?
Karen, you counting?
In fairness, that's
counting.
probably not the right question. It's whether or not this is an interesting trend. I think they'd all agree they should probably go global.
We see a lot of green.
A lot of green.
A lot of green, and you'll see on the screen. It's
an easy crowd, very easy
It's
crowd.
looking like about it's about 70-30. About 70-30 green. I'm surprised actually 30% disagree.
And twit polling?
Is it locked in? Yeah, it looks like 70. It's sort of it's changing every second, but it's about 70-30.
Twit poll likes Kevin.
Exactly.
I think I can't read that, but yeah.
Yeah, it's 72-28. Over to you, Bruce.
All right, next trend. Bing. This is called zero marginal cost education. In the 1970s, ATMs were considered dehumanizing, and bank tellers were the gold standard of service. But tellers got worse, and ATMs got better. Public education seems to be repeating this pattern, where, well, my wife's a teacher, so she's not getting worse. But the oligopolists of big education don't seem to be reading their Clayton Christensen and Innovator's Dilemma. Therefore, there's moment now for massive disruption in education being explained.
So now that I know the way that the audience votes, my trend is apple pie. I wanted to go out on a limb. No,
Peter's against that, by the way.
Don't go out on a limb. They cut those off.
I got motherhood covered.
So for digital natives, public schools are jails. Public schools get about an hour of productivity done per day of education productivity, except for the few that are gifted. And Moore's law improves better than we're growing great teachers. The problem with digital education right now is a design problem. It is inevitable. And any time you see an industry propped up by monopolists, unions, and unpaid deferred maintenance accounts, you know that it's ripe for disruption. So here are a couple things that I've seen. One of the best teachers that I ever met was a guy named Randy Pausch, who did the last lecture at Carnegie Mellon. He took some computer gaming techniques called Alice, an open source program, and used it to basically to get middle school girls to like math by telling stories with the equivalent of poetry magnets. We see at Stanford University for the first time, great professors can get 150,000 students, not just 50 at a time. For the mission of education is to educate the many. We just can't do it in ballrooms, no matter how much we like being here. And you should realize that people who've grown up digital don't like sitting around like you are right now and listening to a purported expert talk. It just doesn't work. They want to do what Morin's doing, is click at the same time so you can fill up the empty spaces between the words of the experts. The best way to train incoming GIs from America in Arabic to save their lives is not through Berlitz, but it's through a video game program developed by USC ISC, a company called Altius that does community college. I've seen how cost-effective and time-effective asynchronous threaded chat seminars are. And the leading trend to watch is that 60% of 2-year-olds in iOS households right now have approved use of iOS devices. So if television can't get their interest, unionized teachers are not going to be able to get their interest.
Okay. Panel, vote on this. Good. Red. Is it green? Green?
Wow.
Green? All greens? Mm-hmm. Explain.
Well, this is actually one of the trends that I was thinking about submitting as well, although does this, the way that Bing wrote it up is slightly different than the way I think of it, because I actually don't think that it's ATM replacement. I actually think the amplification of what people do in various ways. Probably most people in the audience are familiar with Khan Academy. It's pretty amazing what Khan Academy does, which is just basically like YouTube, video lectures, and still what you can do with that is really interesting. I think enabling networks of people to communicate, the same kind of social platform that you have. So one of the investments we made last year was Edmodo, which is kind of social networks for K-12. And the facility of making much better connectivity between students and teachers, teachers and parents, the whole lot, that whole thing is actually, I think, also an amplifier. And they all actually do involve the trend of reducing the cost. But I think that the notion of software is not just, it educates me, it's new software education. It's also all of the amplification in terms of reaching more people, making it free, and making the people involved in this much more powerful.
Yeah, I guess I'd say I've got 3 boys in public schools in Palo Alto, and so I live this particular problem. And what I think a lot of people don't realize, when education, the one-room schoolhouse, the romantic view that everyone has, when that was invented back in, the 18th century, it was because books were expensive. And so it was more efficient to have a teacher there teaching everyone on one of those little slate boards and to get books for everybody, which was the efficient learning technology of the time, but it was expensive. And so that's where kind of teachers came about. And, and so that doesn't mean it's sort of the most efficient model. That being said, I do think that there is something to be said for bringing people together in a physical place to then be able to discuss and share what they've learned. And I think there's some powerful element to that physical presence. So I think I don't think all teaching will occur on a tablet with a game. I think certain parts of it will, but other higher level concepts where discussion is important, where back and forth is important, there should be an offline component that probably remains. But I overall, I agree with the sentiment. I agree this needs to be, reinvented and in a hurry.
Peter,
I don't know. I agree with the sentiment very much. I agree with the trend. I don't quite know what the speed is. It's education stuck in the 19th century. Schools don't look that different from 19th, early 20th century, and so there is sort of this question: why will this happen in the next 5 years specifically? And I do think we have to sort of be very honest about many of the sort of very bad reasons we have the existing system. Like the people in the middle class don't know what else to do, so they teach. So you have incredibly intense lobbies. All the ex-bank tellers have become teachers. They can't go back to being bank tellers. Secondly, there are a lot of parents are very irresponsible. They don't want to actually spend time with their kids, and so school functions as a babysitter function. Its purpose is not actually to educate students. It's to get the kids out of their hair, and then that gets rationalized in all sorts of ways where it's supposed to be good for kids to socialize with other kids and stuff like that. So I think we have to be a little bit more honest about a lot of the very bad reasons that the existing system persists if we're really going to change it.
Do you think kids should not socialize with other kids? They should sit home in front of the computer? I have 3 kids. I'd say that'd be a disaster. But
I think I think there's probably are all sorts of places where that's pretty bad, and it's certainly is rationalized as a way for parents not to have to deal with kids.
They should have Facebook pages, right? No kidding.
Not in kindergarten.
you just described my household. But Steve, we were just talking about, if I may, your son was like he's on his own. Does it depend on the self-motivated learner? Do you have to?
I don't know. I mean, the anecdote he was relating is I'm just blown away at what someone can do if they're inspired to learn on their own. So he's taught himself several computer programming languages. Every parent likes to brag, right? But it's amazing. He writes like compilers of compilers and compilers across Lisp, Java, and this. He just took the AP calculus test, all self-taught over the internet, and he's 12. And so it has me wondering, what could you do if you were inspired and someone motivated you and you had adaptive feedback along the way? And so I've heard Salman Khan speak and Bill Gates about the future of higher ed and with Khan, main school ed. And it's sort of, how do you route around bureaucracy? So I share Peter's despair whenever you look at the existing system. And whenever the wall seems that great, it's usually an entrepreneur routing around that gets you there. So it might have to route around all existing educational frameworks to show a better way, right? Some alternative path of education. It's not a well-formed thought in my mind, but I remain hopeful that it's so powerful and so compelling that magnet will draw someone to the future.
Okay. All right, if you guys are well-educated enough to tell green from red. My apologies to the colorblind. Looks like mostly green.
92.
All right.
More green here.
A lot of parents out there.
There's like a little split.
Yeah, it's like running 70-30.
Eric, you get,
Okay.
I don't know, what does the TWIP poll say? Yeah.
It's 72-28. It's about the same as the last trend. Now it's about 3-1. So you've got a lot of friends on that trend thing. Awesome. Okay. Moving along. Trend number 3. Massive sensors and data. This is Reed's trend. Sensor costs trends to zero. There are sensors everywhere. They're part of everything. In combination, we'll create multiple data collections that power applications and innovations to improve our lives. Genetics, disease, symptom data to automate tricorders, precision diagnosis and personalized medicine, collaborative filtering of all kinds of discovery, from music to information to professional training. Sounds like the Internet of Things. Reed.
You do know what a tricorder is, right?
Yeah, okay.
They're going to date us against.
It's from Star Wars.
I wish I had it.
Yeah, exactly.
I wish I had it.
He knows. All right, so sensor costs are trending to zero. Smaller, cheaper. They'll be in every device, not just the mobile phones. You'll have things that are essentially potentially wearable. You see some of this in Fitbit, et cetera, already. Consider how the cell phone has already changed the whole entire photography industry in terms of most people taking pictures of the camera is a small thing. I think this is one of 4 related trends that combine to a massive pool of data that forms the basis of a number of applications. Second one is that essentially these devices are also computing devices that we're carrying around with us. It's essentially masquerading as a cell phone. Third one is social media, where we input information, the information indexed, the who we are, who we're related to. The fourth one is the cloud, and so this is aggregated in various ways into massive collective applications. This enables all kinds of things. So for example, on the medical side, you've got which diseases on kind of a group mean which symptoms mean which disease, which diagnoses work for different kinds of people, because when you get to this kind of massive amount of data, you begin to actually not treat all human beings the same, but you have personalized medicine through genetics as a function of how this works. But it's not just medical. You have, for example, what information is trending in terms of what skills you need and what you should be paying attention to on a work front. There's which entertainment, there's tons and tons of video and everything else out there. Which should you be reading? You see some of this already, of course, in collaborative filtering on Amazon and YouTube. And you get to even mundane things like traffic. Like one of the things that was really interesting as a study that Starbucks did was they figured out that actually if they reprogrammed all their GPSs for no left turns, they actually had cheaper fuel bills and faster delivery because of the time waiting on left turns out of all the data that came from this. And this is just one small thing of what's happening. And so the trend, I think, will generate all kinds of new applications across all domains of human life that will allow us as individuals and us as a society to be better. I think even in energy, in terms of efficient routing of cars and everything else, will have, and other kinds of transport will have significant impacts across human life.
Okay. Panel? Yay or nay? Yay, yay, yay. Is it unanimous? Yay.
Bunch of yes men.
Wow.
Unanimous.
Wow. We need more.
It's going to be global
more
mass here.
Global first.
It'll be first in Brazil.
You know, there aren't very many people like you who actually learned about symbolic systems and artificial intelligence. So unfortunately, a few of the companies that are generating big data actually have algorithmicists to find signal. And we can see that in most of the social networks that create so much data. Who thinks any of them have a good news feed? Except Path, of course. And so the problem here is, to Peter's point, is this ever going to happen? First, we got to get the algorithmicists off of advertising targeting and onto finding big data signals, and they're just not there yet. They're all doing stupid advertising targeting and retargeting.
We like advertising. We like advertising.
That must be a different panel.
Yeah.
Well, I agree certainly with the sensors part, and I think we don't yet know what to do with a lot of the data, but there is already a ton of data. So if we can just get on top of the data we have, all the extra data will probably lead to these trends. What I'm actually very interested in is the way in which this is likely to play out in a lot of other areas. So I think probably one of the it's sort of part of this trend towards a much more transparent world. So and so there's so the ways in which this is both very good and very bad. So I think you'll have ubiquitous government surveillance. You'll have sort of sensors at every intersection with the ability to see who is there at any given time. I suspect crime will go down tremendously. So probably like one of the basic applications is for home security systems. And so I think there's sort of a lot of applications on the security side of this sort of technology.
On the flip side, what I'd say is one of these things you have to be careful with these trends is sometimes they get carried away and co-opted in a way that isn't totally appropriate. And we had a whole conference on big data the other week, so I have to be careful. But I think in some cases, a lot of data isn't that valuable or isn't nearly as valuable as people think it is. And I can't tell you how many times I've had companies come and approach me and say, well, we're not sure of our business, but we've gathered so much interesting data that we know we're going to be able to package this and sell this and monetize this. And I can't tell you how many of those companies, that you sort of track them later and they found out the data isn't nearly as valuable as they think. I think, that there is a danger that certain types of data can be this cycle's eyeballs. Remember eyeballs? back in the 90s. If you just had enough eyeballs, there were going to be ways to monetize them. So certainly a lot of those eyeballs did prove to be valuable if you had a great service and were able to, to point them to something interesting. But I think just as likely, there's a lot of data that's just garbage and is noise. And it's not that you can't find the signal, there ain't any. And so I think it's important to make a distinction.
I might amplify that a bit and say that in the near term, the challenge, as I think all three people have mentioned, is interpreting all this data. Everyone wants to put the free sensors everywhere, and certainly when it comes to distributed human activity, that's a gold mine. Part of the solution in the near term is kind of interesting because it's not to understand it, right? I think it quickly transcends human understanding. And many of the sort of analytics and approaches that people are going to overlay on these sensor nets are entirely based on machine learning, right? Almost everything at Google today is based on those kinds of algorithms, which are very powerful, underlie protocols like Google Goggles and other things like that, but fundamentally are inscrutable in how they operate, right? That pattern recognition algorithm, if you think about it, you have a sensory network, a layer of almost like a cortical layer of pattern detection, and a few humans pulling the strings to set it all up, but essentially you're setting up Skynet, right? And it's all going to come to a brutal end.
You're supposed to be a techno-optimist.
No, it's great. I mean, it's going to be great till it ends, right?
Well, it does raise some questions about unexpected consequences of the data that you collect, right? So you collect a set of data with a set of people who that is collected for one reason, but then when you put it back together again in a different pattern, maybe gives you other information about individuals or that maybe they didn't want to provide.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, so I just wonder about pushback. Yeah. There was a story with like 36 left. There was a story in the New York Times today that talked about problems in scientific research because people are doing research on sets of data from social networking sites and other places, and then they only have the rights to use the data for their own proprietary means. They can't republish the data, so no one can check the data from the research some of these people are doing. It's worth reading in the Times today. So there you go, plug for the New York Times. Okay, so it's time to vote. Red and green, and your little gizmos. I see a lot of green.
Wow.
Wow.
Sensor says.
Wow, this is a landslide of sensors. So our sensors are saying 8416. Not too many anti-censor people in the crowd today. We're going to get a controversial one of these questions pretty soon. Maybe this one. Go ahead, Bruce.
Okay. Trend 4. All vehicles will go electric. Remember, these trends are, the time frame is 5 years, huge growth within 5 years. So eventually all motor vehicles will transition to, we already have a red card back there, will transition to an electric drivetrain, affording greater efficiency, convenience, and a multitude of new design options. Within 5 years, this inevitability will become clear. This is Steve's trend. This excludes rockets, I assume?
That's right.
And includes golf carts. So we're already on the kind of the shallow part of that curve with golf carts and segways.
Exactly.
But Steve,
sure.
Explain.
And very important. Of course, if anyone was saying red already, that's because it's not going to happen in 5 years, right? We're not going to switch 1 billion vehicles in 5 years. The point of the trend is that hopefully by the end of 5 years, most people in the room wouldn't disagree with the trend. So maybe it's a bit self-referential in that way. So why is it important? First of all, right, the U.S. spends $2 billion a day on oil, and another $4 billion a day if you count for all indirect costs, economic and military, to protect that supply chain. It's big. If you ask anyone, inevitably we will be off oil. You just have to look far enough in the future, right? It's kind of an obvious point. You can't do it forever. It's a question of when, how, right? And so why would it be an important trend over the next 5 years? What's going to be catalytic to change all this? Well, the first is, why are you going to go electric? What about, hybrids or biofuels or this or that? So even if you wanted to burn oil for some reason, and you wanted to burn ethanol and biofuels, you'd be better off doing it in a centralized large plant. A cogen plant from Siemens is about 70% efficient, converting those fuels to electricity. Transmission line, battery, you're still more efficient doing that than today's cars, which average about 20% and waste all that extra energy and heat. They're basically too small an engine to burn oil. So even if you want to burn oil, don't do it in these little engines. Second point, of course, is that it's just much better if you don't burn oil. That's sort of obvious, right? An electric car can be up to 88% efficient, the ones that are driving around today. Okay, so it's a great endpoint. How do we get there? Why now? If we can show a slide, I actually put some visuals up to give people a sense of why you might want to do this. And the short argument is that it's going to be cheaper, more convenient, and give you all kinds of interesting new design options. I don't know if you can put the slide up. Do you have it up there? Okay, so here's a bunch of vehicles, all different types, all different cars that are going to come out either in the next few weeks or in the next couple of years. In fact, there are 29 different electric cars coming out in the next 18 months. Interesting thing about all of these, that you see up there, all these passenger cars, total cost of ownership is less than a Ford Taurus, right? They're really nice cars. They accelerate like crazy. The one on the top right with that really funky doors, an SUV with more space than a minivan and more convenience, but outperforms a Porsche 911, both acceleration and handling. These are cars people are going to want. They're going to be cheaper to own. There's almost no maintenance, and it's just a more efficient way to go. Now, this is great on the high end, but what about, the rest of the world, right? Wouldn't China and other places want to also do this, and how might they afford to go electric? And I'm here to tell you today, there are now 200 million electric vehicles buzzing around China today. They're mostly two-wheeled scooter, Vespa-like things, but there's 200 million of them. If you can go to the next slide, please. It's been the most popular vehicle in China since about 2007. It's been growing like crazy, originally around SARS fears, and now they realize it's cheaper to do one of these than to ride a bus. So in summary, what I'm saying is that people will realize not that we're shifting 1 billion cars in the next 5 years, but we'll hopefully shift 1 billion minds, just like we did around smoking, which we thought was inevitable. Just like our cars, they should not be smoking. And I think we can shift that zeitgeist and that people's thinking around it, because they'll realize the alternative is not like going off the binger or the addiction of oil. It's a car you're going to want to drive, that'll be cheaper to own, and frankly, is a lot more fun.
Okay, thanks. Panel, vote.
I presume it's motor vehicles.
Red.
Motor vehicles. Motor
Now
vehicles.
the red paddles come out.
The reds have arrived.
Now we're just changing minds. We're not driving cars. Okay, it's unanimously
All reds?
red. Ooh,
Wow. All red.
Steve. Nice. Discuss why not.
I just think if we go anywhere, it might be natural gas first, but I don't know if that'll be in 5 years either. But if you look at sort of the cost of natural gas today and the major new deposits that have been discovered, unfortunately through a pretty environmentally unhealthy technology called fracking, it's in the interest of a lot of the major powers for that to be the technology to convert folks to, whether it's through turning that into sort of gasoline equivalents or through having engines be adapted to run on natural gas. I think we might see that be a more important technology, and certainly that's what's firing the power plants today as well. So, and it's in China. China has huge interest in that
even
too.
If you burn the gas centrally, why would you put it in compressed tanks?
Oh, I'm not rooting for. I'm rooting for your trend. I would love your trend to actually occur. Don't get me wrong. I'm just, I guess, a little more cynical as to whether it actually happen. But believe me, I'd love for it to occur. I plan on hopefully buying an electric car here pretty soon.
Yeah, I'm skeptical on it on a whole series of different levels. I don't think I think batteries are a fundamentally old thing. It involves chemistry, positively, negatively charged things, and we cannot really come up with dramatically better batteries because there are basically all the chemicals have been discovered that exist in the periodic table. And so if you look at battery efficiencies, it's a sort of mature industry, and they're just not as good. You basically, electric cars have to be recharged too quickly. The batteries tend to run out. And if you include the cost of the batteries depleting over time and needing to get replaced after 25 to 30,000 miles, the all-in cost ends up being quite high. I think, I think the simplest way. The simplest way. You had your chance. Let me talk now.
Just as a starting point.
The simplest way to, however, rebut this is simply to say, at what price of oil do people actually have an incentive to switch? And if you, my claim is that $10 a gallon is not high enough. That's what gasoline is in Western Europe, and people have small cars. They live in more compact cities, and there have been no meaningful adoption of electric cars in Europe. $10 a gallon is not enough. Maybe you can do it at $20 a gallon.
There aren't that many cars to buy in Europe. They're buying them as fast as you can make them. And the battery thing is just wrong. Someone can do their research, but every one of those statements is wrong. They've already driven more than 200,000 kilometers. To say that they've run out at 35 is just patently wrong. Every car that's tried to go over 35 has. Every single one. So I just can't respond to that.
Well, just to be simple, I actually think I think there's a couple questions. One is the time frame. The second one is actually hybrid versus electric, because I actually agree with you about the drivetrain. And I don't think the only hybrid version, a little bit like natural gas, is actually oil. And the question, I actually also have a question about what are the magnifications on the battery technology. Right now, it may be more than 35 kilometers, but the question is that really going to be the best way to store enough energy in order to have the things you need? And so I actually have been, generally speaking, now you're more expert at this than I, but I'm generally speaking thinking that it'll be electric drivetrain, but hybrid will be there fundamentally in order to get range. Now, whether it's oil or whether it's natural gas or whether it's algae, whatever the thing happens to be, I tend to go there. And anyway, it's a very simple.
That's right. It's the electric drivetrain, but
Yeah.
what's your power plant? So
Yes.
it's not saying batteries take over.
Yeah.
That's an electric vehicle. It's a serial hybrid, but it's kind of an amphibian.
Yeah, but
it's
you said
good.
not hybrid, so that was the reason why I was.
Yeah, hybrids as we know it.
Yes.
Right? Yep.
Yep.
I agree with Reed. I would suggest that the only thing that would cause America to be all electric cars is to lose the economic trade war with China and have it imposed on us. And other than that, I think we have to wait for 20-year-olds to start voting, because climate change doesn't mean as much as taxes to the bulk of voters in Western democracy who want to protect their status quo, and we can't get 20-year-olds to vote.
Anybody on the panel drive an electric car?
I hope so.
There you go.
Anybody on the panel
Prius-
shareholder in Tesla?
Prius drivers? Any Prius drivers?
So
Time to vote?
time to vote. Oof.
Wow.
Steve, you stepped into this one. Wow. Okay.
Looks like the Politburo in here. Wow.
So far, that's the winner.
Yeah. Raise your other hand if you have an SUV.
Yeah. How many people in the audience drive an electric car?
With the green.
Yeah.
With the green.
With a green.
yeah, green.
Don't hold up a red that you
Suitably
confuse
green.
everyone. Right.
All right, we'll have.
And it's 65-35
Yeah.
against.
Again, it's growing.
The motion is defeated. Wow. Okay.
But it's all the votes would have been all green in Nebraska.
Okay. Number 5. This is Peter's trend. A shift towards technocracy, doing more with less. Democrats want government to do more with more. Republicans, this is the election year trend, by the way. Republicans say government should do less with less. Technology and Peter say you should, technology, I'm screwing up my own joke here. Technology might allow us to do more with less. Peter?
Well, this is sort of a pretty broad trend and pretty broad point. If you look at the U.S. having government deficits of 10% of GDP as far as the eye can see, and you ask what sort of is going to be the link between technology and government, I think you can sort of suggest there are 3 main types of links. There are government subsidies of technology. I think that's going to stop. I think any company that requires getting subsidies from government will go out of business because there's no money left. I think you can, but then I think the areas for technology to look at very carefully are ways to basically substitute for government or replace government, and there will be a lot of pressure to try to figure out ways to optimize services. There's a pessimistic view, which is that nothing will happen, and you will simply end up with, relentless austerity. But probably the single area that's the most backward in our society are all the government services. Whenever you have an experience where you encounter the government, whether it involves going to the DMV office, any of these other sorts of things, it sort of is stuck 40, 50, 60 years in the past. I think education is sort of a specific example. I think it's true of almost all other areas, and so I think an area of an important area for innovators to look at is, are there ways to replace government services through computers and technology and automation? And while I'm not going to claim that all of it can be done, I don't think you can necessarily get rid of all the teachers in education. I will claim that it's an area you should look at very carefully. Sort of the, we've ended up investing in a number of different businesses over the last 5-6 years where this was a big theme. It was not something we really intended to be. The one both Steve and I are involved in is a company called SpaceX. They just launched the rocket. The optimistic case is that the space program has become too expensive for NASA, but that there will be an ability to have a space program continue into the 21st century that will do more for less, cheaper rockets, and where you have sort of a much more technocratic approach that sort of sidesteps the bureaucracies that you have in place in government. And I think that's that's a trend that's worth exploring in many other ways.
Okay. Panel, are we going to do more with less? Look first. Green, sort of half. What's down there? What do we got?
Two reds down
Two
here.
reds.
Yeah.
Let's start with the fence sitter.
I don't know if maybe if we could get a chance maybe Peter to explain a little more, because I'm not sure if I understand if you're saying there will be actual change in government, or if technocracy, meaning techno-led businesses routing around government and private enterprise are the future and just going to start ignoring government.
It is some combination of both. So I think government will run out of money. So there will be a change in what government does as it runs out of money. That you get that out of the 10% of deficit spending. And then businesses will possibly replace it or will sell things to government for cheaper.
Okay.
I think we're actually already seeing some of this. I think, for example, what Bloomberg is doing with 311 in New York is an example of essentially deploying technology in order to make networks in the city more efficient. I think it'll be slow because of the political process. I understand that you think it'll be accelerated by essentially versions of bankruptcy or lack of economics. But I actually think the notion is that just like any other trend, like anything from a DMV process to, I mean, you can do traffic school online now. I think you already see elements of this essentially accelerating. And so I think it's an inevitable form of how do you have transformation in society by using technology in order to get more productivity.
What about the military? You don't need a battleship when you have a computer virus that can take out an Iranian nuclear facility. It's cheaper.
Yeah, well, and also that's more the Chinese specialty, but yes.
We got people who do that
We're better at
too.
it than they are, but they're good. They're getting
So let's hear from the non-believers, Theodore.
Well, I would say I think we're certainly seeing on the social front doing more with more. The Facebook and Twitter have broken through the Dunbar number, and I believe that's going to be a good thing. Mary Meeker thinks this round of technology companies are going to be bigger than the last round. So I think we're seeing some more, and the disruptors are going to be bigger. We're certainly seeing some entrepreneurs doing more with less, thanks to things like Amazon Web Service. But the do more with less and technocracy smack a little too much like of sloganism to me, and I can't help but try to falsify slogans. And I think it's easy to punch holes in. I'm not sure what technocracy means, but if it means that politicians will have to be able to do Algebra 2 and code in Java, I'm in favor.
Yeah, it's more the government that I reacted to. And unfortunately, what you find is technology doesn't bring less spending. It actually brings more, actually. Anytime you make the cost of doing something a lot cheaper, what happens is we do a lot more of it, right? And so, for example, and I'll bring this to government for a second, but if you look at, say, virtualization technology, and the whole idea around virtualization technology is it allowed you to consolidate servers, and you'd have, your data center would be a lot more efficient, and data center heat and all this would go down. And of course, what happened is just the opposite. Because it made it so cheap to create a new server and to spin one of these things up, and everyone in every department could do it without having to get central IT approval now because it was so cheap and easy. They exploded. And then the number of physical servers that you needed to accommodate all these new virtual servers exploded, and data center spending went up. Same thing with car technology. You make that car more efficient, and you instead of getting a car that then gets 70 miles to the gallon, what do? You make a bigger, heavier car. You make an SUV. And that's what our world tends to do. So in the government, you give them the technology to make something more efficient. You put unmanned drones instead of pilots flying these planes. They'll make more of them. They'll drop more bombs, and they'll make themselves even more powerful because unfortunately that's a political and a human process more than a technological one. So I think even if we do adopt technology, I'm unfortunately not convinced that that'll mean smaller government. I understand that we're running out of money. And so we'll try to starve the beast. But unfortunately, the government also can print the money. And so we've seen that they've chosen to do that rather than stop with the spending. So can't go on forever, but unfortunately, I think it's going to go on for 5 more years.
So just one quick clarification, Peter. Do you think this is a technology trend that's driven by the economics? I mean, which is leading the way here? Is it the technology is driving this trend, or is it the economics of budgetary pressure that drives the trend?
It's the combination of both. So I think the budgetary pressure means that a trend like this is going to be necessary if you're going to maintain various services. And then I think it's been an extremely underexplored area in technology that it would be promising for more people to look at.
Great. Time to vote.
A lot of red over here.
This is the closest we've seen, but it's that's 55-45 against.
Well, that's on that. Otherwise, I think it's not 55-45.
I think it's not.
Just the counting.
Oh, now it's changed. Now it's 60-40 against.
Oh, I think he was talking about.
The Twitter poll vote is different than
he wasn't looking.
I was not counting reds and greens. I was looking at the
technocracy kicked in.
Yeah.
The technocracy kicked in. Yes. We have a secret government representative that's in control of the poll.
It's moving around a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of voting going on from
Still
Washington
voting
for some reason. The numbers still moving around a little bit. Bruce?
So Romney and Obama are in a dead heat. You saw that, right? Okay, trend 6, Kevin's trend. It's just the venture cycle. The fortunes of Silicon Valley rarely mirror those of the real world because the ebb and flow of creative disruption follows a different pattern and a 14 to 16-year cycle rather than the macroeconomy. We appear to be right on schedule. Kevin, I don't know what this means, so I need you to explain this.
Give me a chance. But I will say if my other one was apple pie, this one might be motherhood. So
Don't sell past the close.
That's right. So think back to let's just say a few years ago when a couple of college dropouts, a group of college dropouts, let's say, invented a platform that was at first dismissed as a toy and thought perhaps for a niche market that then turned out to be a really important platform that changed the world, and entire new application companies were built on that platform that grew very, very quickly, almost astonishingly fast, that led to more companies in the entire industry created to the point where people were accusing it of being a bit of a bubble or they're getting out ahead of their ski tips. And what if I told you that a few years ago was 1976, and those group of college dropouts was Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and the platform was the PC. The application companies at that time were Lotus, WordPerfect. Maybe you'd sort of count the later ones like your Adobe or Intuit and things like that. Let's fast forward to the 90s, and you had a college, not dropout, but a college graduate student named Mark Andreessen, who created a platform called the web browser with Mosaic and the Netscape. The major application companies being created on that, essentially being Yahoo, Amazon, eBay. And then people getting a little bit out ahead of themselves, getting a little bit ahead of adoption, like sock puppets. And, the cycle sort of corrects itself. And because I can't really comment on a lot of the companies today, I'll let you draw your conclusions as to whether that pattern holds today. I get asked a lot of time, are we in the middle of a bubble? And I say, we're just in the middle of the venture cycle, and how it plays out and how it corrects is a little different each time, but that's kind of where we're at. And so I guess the prediction, which may not be so bold, is that the next great inventor of the next great platform is probably about 7 years away, and he or she is probably 12 years old right now. So, be really good to your nieces and nephews and sons and grandchildren, because you might be working for them in the not too distant future. So what's old is new again, and the whole point is that this is a cycle that repeats itself, and it's not necessarily tied to the macroeconomy, China, taxes, Republicans, Democrats. It's sort of what we do.
So if the trend is wrong, it would be because there's some fundamental break that the cycle doesn't.
So if you disagree with this, you think we're not in the middle of the cycle. This will be, this can go on for 25 more years, and sort of be unabated. It won't ebb and flow in the same way, and that is all just if you disagree with it, you basically think that what I just did was sort of a convenient lens on a lot of much more random events. The one thing I will say is the reason it's 14 to 16 years and it's not accelerating, and you'd think it would accelerate with technology, and it's not, because that's a generation of people. That's how long it is for a generation of people. And the new fundamental platform needs to be invented by someone who's a kid, who was a kid and grew up with the prior platform. Semiconductors led to PCs, led to the internet, led to kind of what we have today. And those are the people who need to reinvent. It's not an executive at IBM who invented the PC. It was a couple of kids.
Right.
And so that's why these things happen in these phases. That would be my assertion.
So are you going to fund Steve's son? Because he's 12, just saying.
He's the one. He's the one. Do you guys want to vote? With her?
Ooh.
All right.
Wow.
That's controversy. They're all retiring in 12 years, so before the cycle's over. Explain why the bearishness about.
Well, I disagree with this on moral grounds. So, I think whenever you say there's a cycle of 14 to 16 years or fill in any number of years, then it means you don't have to do anything till the next cycle happens. And I would claim that people should continue to work really hard right now and not take a break for 5 years. And secondarily, I disagree with it on a sort of logical ground, since, Kevin, I don't think you're going to take a vacation for the next 5 or 6 years.
That you don't want me to take a vacation for the next 5
He
years?
doesn't think, he's predicting you won't be.
Maybe a few months.
My actual disagreement is that I think it's accelerating. I don't agree with the 14 to 16 years. I actually think it's moving faster than that. I think that one of the things that we're beginning to see is trends moving towards the disruptive trends coming at faster and faster curves. I think part of that's the result of Moore's Law, which I think continues in terms of computational cycles. I think the Moore's Law and the computational cycles are beginning to hit other industries in terms of when you're integrating software into other things. Like, for example, a car either has or will soon have more lines of software than Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, et cetera, in the vehicle. And I actually think that all lends to a faster and faster evolution of what's happening. And so my disagreement isn't that is the periodicity of the cycle.
And one thing I will say is 2 hallmarks of the cycle are the first thing that you know when you're really into the acceleration phase is when everyone says it's different this time. And so when you begin seeing the headlines, well, but it's different this time, that's the first sign that it isn't. And the other thing I'll say is when you're in the bottom part, and all of us remember the bottom part, and some of us remember 2 bottom parts better than I do, is when they say, well, it's dead. And Silicon Valley's dead, and venture capital's dead, and innovation's dead. It's fundamentally different. It's spread around the world. So keep your eye out for those 2 things. When you hear it's dead, that's the time to sort of dive in. When you hear it's different this time, it doesn't mean stop. It just means, keep your head on straight, to Peter's point. So no, I don't think you want to retire for 5 years. And some great companies were created in that ebb tide. Peter's, being one of them, or at least surviving through one of them with PayPal. So, that's a caveat.
Hey, Kevin, I'm the one green pedal, I think. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting observation, because we've seen the exact same trend in some data we were looking at, aggregating across portfolios. And the thing that strikes me, though, about your explanation, why I like it intergenerationally, and it makes sense when you think about any one generation, there's, of course, a continuous pipeline of kids at different generations. In any given year, there's a new 12-year-old. So it's like, who's rebelling against who? So I think if you step back and look at the aggregate portfolio of, let's say, well, how would you measure it? Let's say venture returns or private equity returns. I actually have a graph, if you could put it up there. You find the 16-year cycle in the flow of capital into and out of industries. Right? You had a VC boom around the mini computers, and then another one 16 years later around the personal computer, then another one about 16 years later around the internet. And every one of those was followed by a private equity boom and bust. Each one of
just do a slide?
I just threw that up because I thought, on the fly.
That is unbelievable.
It's magic.
The private equity guys keep relabeling themselves with each cycle. The VCs just, come boom and bust, boom and bust. Now, the magnitude of this accelerates. The spoils, the winner-take-all network effects of modern businesses, these new waves are much bigger than the prior ones. But why? Why 16 years? And the only thing I could think of, in addition to intergenerational, was the feedback loops that occur in any dynamic system that has long delay lines, right? So if you're designing an amplifier, you have a short delay, you have a very dialed-in amplifier. an electrical circuit. If you put a long delay in, you get an oscillator. The longer the delay, the longer the period of oscillation. Well, think about entrepreneurship. You start a company, it takes many years to find out if you're successful. At the venture portfolio levels, it's many years still. At the fund level or the brand or franchise level, decades before you might go out of business, let's say, after years of bad returns. So whenever you have these long feedback things, you're going to have long wave cycles of up and down. It's just like DRAM, capacity planning, or any industry where you've got big capital decisions and then long feedback cycles. You're going to see oscillations. And then why 16 years? Not sure. Maybe that's company formation, portfolio aggregation, booms and busts of capital cycles, and company formation. So it would lead to that trend. That's why I'm green.
Maybe it's because something has to be big, has to have become a success for someone to get inspired to either kill it or undermine it.
Yeah.
Like movements in art where you won't rebel against it unless it's something worthy of rebelling against. And it takes a while for that to happen.
Right.
Well, that's a 2-order of magnitude Moore's Law time frame. And so maybe that means something. I grew up in Detroit, a city about which Reed wrote. And Detroit did just not work on a 16-year cycle. It started peaking after World War II, and it started dying in the 70s. And if you grew up in Detroit, you didn't think 16 years was magic. So I think this talk about the venture cycle is very parochial and very Sandhill oriented, and I think the rest of the world doesn't care about Sandhill.
That's exactly the point. I totally agree. That's why if you read the thing, it said that we are in our own world here in Silicon Valley, and we're completely different than the rest of the world. So I actually agree with that.
All right, let's throw it out to you all for a vote. I guess agree means the cycle holds. Disagree means it's different this time, which we're not supposed to believe either. It's pretty evenly split over here.
50-50. Little redder. Pretty even, though.
Yeah.
So the stats say 52-48? Much like we might see in November. 52-48. Pretty steady. Wow.
The council has spoken.
Exactly. Okay. Trend number 7. This is Bing's trend, the gamification of everything. As Lance Armstrong wrote, every second counts. As digital natives increasingly multitask, and as the social web creates geometric growth in posts, the battle is for engagement. For the growing population of game players, reportedly 70% of Americans, games are important systems for creating meaning and can increase behavior by 25 to 100%. That way you can do things like vote when you go to panels and decide if you agree with the trends from the stage. Bing?
Yeah, games, I would assert, are the second least expensive way to create systems of meaning after religion, and games don't cause wars. So, however, it's been very difficult for games to do anything but entertainment. 70% of Americans report that they play some kind of online game at least once a month now, which is somebody like me who started doing the games business in 1982. I have to admit, seemed unimaginable, and it's still a little hard for me to get my arms around. But once you buy into a system of meaning, which can be created for free with virtual rewards, once you create a system of meaning, it self-sustains. 2 thoughts here. One is that when I was growing up, there were no numbers on the surface of popular entertainment. The only place numbers showed up was in the sports page, especially in baseball. And every economist I've ever met of my era started out as a baseball stats fan. Now The Sims, which is 60% female players, a bunch of numbers on it. In fact, when 2 Sims make friends, you see numbers come out of their head. You're rated on a scale of 0 to 100 on relationship. 90 is love, and at 90, new verbs are permitted between 2 Sims. And I have to believe that women have been doing this their whole life, trying to decide if you just went from 89 to 90 or 90 to 89. And the second thing that civilians don't understand about games is cooperation outperforms competition 3 to 1. That might not make sense to the people who set up tonight as if it's a competition, but the only people who prefer competition to cooperation are 15 to 25-year-old boys and those who think they are. There's psychologists say there's a 3-to-1 difference. You have 3 times more emotion for loss than you do for gain. So games are not primarily competitive. And where we used to say, he who dies with the most toys win, I think in the future we will say, she who dies with the most points wins.
Okay.
One clarification, by everything, do you mean like literally everything, or do you mean software, like, or the gamification of toilets?
You ever try to potty train
I'm
a
just
child?
curious how far you're going with the thesis.
I think there will be game-like UI on everything that competes for consumer attention.
So,
And
yes.
toilets?
Yeah, toilets.
Probably not everyone. You and I may not want to gamify toilets, but I bet in 5 years there'll be a gamified toilet.
Target practice.
In Japan. Yeah, Japan, I think, would be.
Yeah.
Panel?
Well, ask 15-year-old boys what would they rather have a toilet that had games in. Have you ever done those little target things?
Yeah.
I rest my case. but I don't think that'll be
Those
ever.
are 3-year-old boys. Though, right?
Steve just
Well,
went
I'd
green
like
on
to
that.
change my vote after that.
Okay. Red, green, red.
Have you read the book Everybody Poops?
Yes.
It's going to be a game.
I hate to think how you're going to invest in that trend. Okay.
I was green and red and green.
Green.
You're oscillating.
He's playing games with us.
Reed, you disagree.
Well, I mean, actually, so I think all software, I agree. Like, I was green at Bing's opening statement of the second least expensive way of creating systems meaning. I agree with the systems meaning. I think all software will have game dynamics in it. I think you look at all of these different interfaces, I think.
Then the profile completion thing in LinkedIn
As
is
an
a great
example. Yes, as an example. So that.
And what percent improvement in behavior does it get? You probably have never announced that.
We've never announced it, so I probably can't do it from the stage, given it's streaming. But I actually, so I have a massive agreement with the gamification of many things. The reason I asked the toilet question was because it's many things, not everything.
Yeah,
I think
this
is where my
assertion
view.
is falsifiable.
Yes.
Well, the reason I go back and forth is it obviously isn't going to be everything, but it is going to be a lot of things. And so if he just stopped short of that, it would have been, I think, spot on. So the way we work in the enterprise, the way we interact with just about everything, and I think the place where...
Gamification of one standard deviation away from everything.
There we go. Perhaps. But there are still some things that robots would do instead of a gamer. So I think the place where it's going to have the most purchase is routine automated work. The stuff that's mentally stultifying that still occurs all over the planet in enterprises and in crowdsourced work. If you can add a game dynamic and add autonomy and a sense of purpose, that thing, whether it's filling out a form or doing some job someone hates, will become better when it's gamified. I'm not so sure about the restrooms and the everything thing because maybe just I haven't got my head around that yet. But perhaps with some baby steps, if we just start with human activities that aren't being replaced by robots, well, they should be replaced by this. Whether you look at Fold It, whether you look at all these interesting, baby examples that are out there, you take something that wasn't being solved, and all of a sudden, you find that this person in England is the best protein folder on the planet. She didn't know she had these cognitive skills until the game came up, and she just loves competing and being the best at what she does. She sort of gets into the flow, as Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi talks about so much. You can turn routine work into something satisfying when it's in a game.
So I disagree with the everything. I also think the gamification term is a bit ambiguous, since does it mean that you take something and you make it 1% a game, or sort of 30% a game, 80%? And so since I think 1% is not enough, even though maybe from 0 to 1 technically it would be gamification, I think of it more as a threshold. You have to make it at least 30, 40% a game where it's primarily experienced as a game. And I think there are a lot of things you can't actually do that with. And so if you go back to the education thread we had earlier, there are all sorts of people who try to do educational software, and there's all sorts of entertainment, and then there's all sorts of software that's entertainment that's supposed to be educational. What I think happens with most of those companies is they have a very tough choice. Do you make it more entertainment or more education? And it's actually incredibly hard to get something that's optimal on both. And so if you have something that's a bimodal distribution, where the things that are more educational are not entertainment, and the things that are more entertainment are not education. That tells you something very deep about the structure of reality, that there are a lot of things that cannot be turned into games. And if you do, you end up getting rid of a lot of important things in life.
I think what Peter said was very deep. I'm not sure I completely understand it, but I think I agree that there are certain. The problem I have with gamification, I think it works at some levels, and I think it can work at a shallow level with a shallow veneer. What I worry about is when it's used to replace an authentic experience, and that sometimes when something gets gamified, it works for a little while, and then it collapses if it doesn't promote authentic behavior or an authentic experience underneath. And so I think what drives people to love an experience and the delight they get from whether it's using a software product or interacting with something or school or art, there are point systems and people like the points, but at the end of the day, what makes people really participate is, I think, something different. And it's a deeper connection. You use Dropbox and you're delighted with that application. It's not because there are any goddamn points associated with it. It's because it's an awesome application that allows you to get things done, in your life better. What makes you go to and watch a movie? Is it because I'm getting, points from the cinema that I go to, or is it because I love the movie and I'm really moved by it? And so I think that there's a certain, and even in Yelp, in the beginning they gave people sort of Starbucks points or whatever to be, highly rated sort of Yelpers, but then later it was because there are people who just love sharing. And it isn't because it's a game or it's collaborative. Now, what we might argue with is other people might define what I just said in those forms of delight as just a bigger game and a more elaborate one. I view the worry is with every time I hear someone come in and say, well, if I gamify this application, it's going to get more usage. No, I think you just better build a really great application. And then maybe gamification helps kickstart it, but the really important thing is to build something that has some organic depth and touch and feel to it. Authentic feel to it.
Charles Darwin would disagree.
Perhaps.
But he's not here. Okay, so time to play our game. Speaking of games, gamification. Not a lot of game players. Nobody wants to play a game. 58-42.
I got a 90% green in high schools.
Right?
We should get them to come to the panel next year.
Or Goldman Sachs. Yeah.
Goldman Sachs.
I mean, making money, Wall Street's the greatest game of all, right?
Some days it's a better game than other days. Okay.
All right, trend number 8. This is Reed's trend called the new hardware, bits to atoms. Open source patterns now applied to hardware, collective design, bases with rapid modification, flexible manufacturing, producing limited run and unique devices, 3D printing means a revolution in custom and unique goods. Ultimately, the revolutions in biology as well, biological, medical devices, solutions, when we can make anything that our minds imagine.
Yeah, you can print anything. So what's new is you have kind of a whole scale of custom manufacturing. You've got manufacturing through manufacturing processes, kind of how you organize factories all the way into 3D printing. It's not just the fact that you have kind of now a panoply of designs, but also what you can print. And so, what I think is you'll see kind of interesting revolutions across all kinds of different things. So the easy ones will be, as opposed to just kind of getting, Zazzle mugs and Jelliskins and other kinds of skins on things, I think you'll begin to see different, unique kinds of products, a lot more innovation. So all of the revolution innovation we're seeing in software, I think you'll begin to see elements of that within kind of hardware products. I think that's what we're already on the verge of seeing in the next 5 years. I don't know if you'll see the biology and the medical stuff within the next 5 years. You'll see some of it. But like, for example, printing a new heart out of your genetics, I think you'll eventually see in terms of like heart transplant, these sorts of things. I don't think it'll be in the next 5 years, but I think we're trending towards that. And I think that the ability to custom print, for example, pharmaceuticals and drugs as things that would interact with your genetics in a particular way is one of the things that will come from moving software into this flexible manufacturing process. And so that's the highlight. I'm trying to have an extra minute, but that's what it is.
You think that happens in 5 years?
I think the hardware goods part of it is going to happen in the next 5 years. right? Because I think you can already see it in everything from the way they're actually doing. The factories in China aren't just a question of low-cost labor. There's actually the way they organize and the way they're doing everything, including high-end goods, all the way to 3D printers, where you're beginning to see them print things that are actually physical device, physical substance that could actually be products.
But when you start talking about like the pharmaceutical
No, I said that's further. I think that's the reason why that's additional.
15 years, 20 years?
I would say more 10 for at least some interesting things. Not everything, but at least some really life-changing things.
Yeah, we did one of our more popular tech stories the last 2 months was this guy whose son wanted to put his Lego and connect it with his Lincoln Logs and Tinker Toys and K'NEX and Zoob, and he made a universal toy connector from a 3D printer. Now he connects everything. He hasn't been sued yet by Lego, but they're watching him. They're watching him. All right, let's vote on the this idea of printing whatever you want. It's green. Peter?
What we got down there?
Can't
We got
see.
one of each on this side.
One of each over there?
Yeah.
Wish we could print these panels.
I know. We look
Green,
at curves.
green. This is halfway. Thing's halfway there. Bing, why are you on the fence about that?
I've actually seen from the inside at Zazzle how hard it is to build hardware APIs, and so almost built or a platform that you can build on top of. It took microprocessor companies a long time to figure this out, and at the core, what I've discovered is that hardware and software people don't really get along. Hardware people are kind of like car mechanics, and software people are kind of like the soul of poets, and they don't know how to talk. Hardware guys fix things by hitting them with a rock, and software people go away and just patch stuff. So I think this is going to be harder than we hope. It's going to take people who think like API creators and love hardware. And I look forward to meeting that person.
Yeah,
But I wish it were true.
yeah, I think it's going to happen, but it's going to not be as big, a phenomenon over the next 5 years to earn sort of top 10 status, if you will, meaning amongst prototypers, hackers, if you will, like the Homebrew Computer Club, right? In the early days, there'll be folks that do that. But I think one of the things that fundamentally limits the physical design of things is the human capacity and the current design tools that we use to work in 3 dimensions. Right? There's just been so many 3D related things from VRML to current, FIAB that limits human creativity. There's something about that data entry problem. And the cost and sort of clumsiness of the systems, I think, makes it more, frankly, of one-offs. And why do you need one of something? Yes, some medical prostheses, there are things where you do need one thing adapted to you. But when it comes to mass production of hardware and then personalization in software, there seems to be a lot more purchase, right? So if you look at the trend in computing, it's grand simplification. No, you get one device. It's your iPhone. It's your iPad. There's no variations. And it's a lot of variation in software, a lot of personalization in software. The same in biology. I think the revolution over the next 5 years in synthetic biology is at the code level, reprogramming microbes to do useful work, not so much forcing, if you will, a sculpting process on macro scale stuff. So I think when you change the code, be it biology or in software, you get a lot more purchase than when you think about hacking about physical things.
So I agree with Reed's trend because I thought of it as actually, and I disagree with both Steve and Bing, because I think it's fundamentally about it just becoming a software problem. And so if you can do enough on the level of bits, then you don't actually need the hardware people, and you can basically just have it as a software problem. So it's the combination. It's not, the title was not the new hardware bits and atoms. I think that's harder. Bits to atoms, that seems both culturally something companies can do, and then I think you can have a debate over what kinds of things you can do this in. And I think sort of there's this is the timing and scope question for all these topics. And so I could imagine it being done for at least very simple things. So if you want to have an architectural model for a house, could you do something that assembles a 3D model of the house based on a blueprint? And that seems not that hard. Now maybe that's not that interesting, but it probably has some value. And then there sort of are questions about how complex the 3D systems are that you can build. in this sort of a process. But it seems to me that if it's just on the level of bits, it can certainly be done.
Kevin, do you want to add? You're against, I guess, right?
Do I have to comment if I don't have anything
No.
intelligent to say? I don't have anything intelligent to say on this one.
Okay.
In the world of media and real estate, it seems like the best strategy is to short atoms. Maybe in consumer goods, you could go long atoms, but that would be an interesting hedge. Other people at the panel are better at hedging than I am.
The price of a 3D printer is now dropping to where it's, what, it's about $8,000?
But first, somebody's got to figure out what to do with all the shopping centers.
There can't be enough bowling alleys. Let's put it out to a vote. Yeah. It's about half. It looks like
It's pretty, well,
reddish.
looks reddish. But the,
Reddish.
I don't know, maybe there's a lot of people out in TV land who are not agreeing with people in the room, because the electronic voting is 3-1 in favor.
Well,
74-26.
Zazzle.com.
10% discounts tonight to all you. Anybody holding a red card is.
You know, those red cards were all manufactured on a. Never mind. Okay. Number 9. Steve, Moore's law accelerates beyond silicon. Well, this is like a really big idea in a fairly quick statement. When we consider Moore's law in the abstract, the dropping cost of computation is not tapering off. Rather, it will accelerate further still as we look beyond the silicon era. What's beyond the silicon era?
Something big and new and different. If we can put the slide up, please. So obviously, I'm not going to try to defend Moore's law just chunks along and nothing's new. That would not be new. In fact, Moore's law is in many ways the mother of all trends, sort of metaphorically, in the sense that there's not any other trend you can think of that lasts 110 years as important and relates to technology. At least I can't think of one. And if you look at Kurzweil's version of this, which you see a sort of a modern rendition up here, you know, there's nothing about Moore's law that's specific to integrated circuits, right? It translates back through vacuum tubes to mechanical devices. And on this, by the way, this is an exponential curve. If you look at the right axis, a straight line would be an exponential. So the trend, the prediction, the argument is that if, in fact, we're going to pick up in speed, that the experience of how much compute power you can buy for a fixed amount of money is actually going to accelerate beyond the pace we've been on. And one simple way would be if this curve, in fact, is curving up, which some data analysis indicates it might, that trend would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But how, right? Beyond silicon, we'll probably move to molecular electronics, doing things with carbon nanotubes, as IBM and Nantaro and a bunch of companies are all predicting that we'll have to keep scaling things smaller and smaller at the transistor level. But it's also, I should come back to this and say, it's also the mother of all trends in that just about everything we've talked about on this panel and just about everything disruptive in entrepreneurial innovation relies on Moore's law continuing, right? So whether you're in biotech, telecom, obviously computing, software, increasingly just about every industry eventually becomes subject to a simulation science instead of a trial and error experimental science, and it moves on to a much more rapid pace of innovation, right? So this is what we see in industry after industry and why entrepreneurs keep having opportunities to start new businesses in new and interesting areas. So it's important, right? A lot of people within the industry predict it's going to end when they look just at silicon. So what could take us beyond this? Well, it's not just getting them smaller, 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 because eventually you're going to reach some fundamental physics limits, right? It's going to be architectural improvements, right? Even Intel's CEO, who has a lot to vest in the old model, says we're going to have much more computational and architectural improvements in the next 10 years than the prior 30. Not Moore's law itself, but the systems level improvements. Things like mimicking the brain, which is 100 million times more power efficient per calculation than our best computers. But let me share something, if I may, on the next slide, which is completely different. Something to give you, I try to geek out at least once every one of these sessions. Something completely out of left field that may or may not change the world and is nothing like what you've seen before. This guy, Geordie Rose, started a company called D-Wave. He uses little niobium circuits that are super cooled down just above absolute zero to engage literally parallel universes to compute. Sounds like science fiction. He's here sold one to Lockheed Martin. If you go to the next slide, and I'll just try to end with this if you do the build. He's plotted a curve, I called it Rose's law, with just a few data points going over 7 years, showing the number of qubits, again, growing exponentially. But here, the power of the computer grows as a power 2 to the n, meaning every time you add a single qubit, it doubles the power of the computer. So if you go forward one more click, Soon, within a year, we'll have computers that are competitive with existing ones. In 2009, it already outperformed Google Goggles by Google. They use this computer to outperform their own data centers. One more click, it gets kind of weird. Suddenly it starts to outperform all computers on Earth combined. One more click, it outperforms the universe. One more click. What am I talking about? This is if you use the entire matter of the universe to compute for all time, it can solve certain problems that are otherwise unsolvable, like the traveling salesman problem, portfolio optimization, things that are used throughout machine learning, that are used today through heuristics. We do our best. We don't actually solve these problems. It relates to molecular simulation and everything. Now, it may or may not play out. It's just one example, but it's completely unlike anything we've ever seen with Moore's Law before. And if it continues for just 3 more years, the way it has in the past 7, then within the next 5 years, we'll see computing accelerate way off of Moore's Law within the scientific community domain. That's it.
You guys buying in?
Yeah.
I think, yeah, he deserves it.
Can you say that again? Can you do that again?
Sure. The trend in the next, let's try to summarize. It's that it's not just silicon. There's new things coming, and it could accelerate the pace of change when you measure it not as transistor counts, but as computational power that you can buy for a certain amount of money, right? There's a 25 gigaflop computer being developed this year by NVIDIA, right? The GPU company, fastest computer on Earth. It's a compilation of different architectures, different ways of building computers that will continue Moore's Law beyond what we've known it to be.
Now, is it a slight acceleration or a massive acceleration of Moore's Law that you're arguing for?
I'm arguing for a curve that leaves, so exactly, on a linear scale it'll be massive, on an exponential scale it'll be, like that.
Okay.
Is it going to be super cooled with coal-powered plants?
No, it's actually much lower energy consumption per calculation, of course. Otherwise it'd be non-viable.
Okay, all right, let's see some paddles.
Yeah.
Is it using assembly language?
Show us your paddles now.
Show us your paddles.
Did you say assembly language? No.
Well, that's my point, is you have to have a different...
Yeah, different programming model, more like machine learning, where you program inputs and outputs like a neural network and it just learns. Yeah.
Paddles.
Wow, paddles. Red.
Play the game. Play the game, Martini.
Kevin?
Play the game, Martini. Let's go. Red.
A lot of red.
By the way, I should say I knew in advance that my trends were 2 of the things that Peter disagrees with more than anything else I know that he disagrees with.
Well, I think Moore's law has been going pretty quickly as is. So to accelerate beyond Moore's law sets an incredibly high benchmark. And I'm sort of uncomfortable actually fully disagreeing with Steve on this because he knows a lot more about this than I do, I feel, so I sort of want to be pretty careful in what I say. What strikes me, however, as odd if such an acceleration is going on or about to start is that nobody is talking about it or doing it. So if you sort of think about the great companies that were, Intel, the semiconductor companies of the 70s, 80s, 90s, that were based on sort of faster and faster computers. I think there have actually been fewer startups in the last decade that were based on computers being able to go much faster. So my intuition has been there's actually been some sort of deceleration, and maybe all the gains have been captured by existing big companies, but that's again sort of an odd pattern. And so I'll just observe not so much about a claim about the science or the technology, but about sort of the venture and corporate ecosystem. And the last decade seems to have been a deceleration of such companies. And if you're right, this will be a very big trend that will catch a lot of people by surprise.
I think I disagree because I think Moore's law, if you actually look at the forces that gave rise to it, was this entire semiconductor industry, an ecosystem, right? So you had the people who made the fab equipment and the lithography, and you could shrink the size of the transistor, and this whole positive cycle, of the semiconductor roadmap, and this whole industry kind of pushed that to happen, right? And it was along this dimension of reducing the size of the transistor. And so if we're going to do this along a different, vector or whatever, I don't know what you call it, a different computing paradigm, quantum computing, whatever it is, I guess what my concern is that I don't know if the world kind of needs to get on that standard for that whole industry to get created, and that ecosystem to get created to constantly move it down whatever dimension that is, if it's shrinking the size or making it faster. And I just don't know if that's going to get created. And so even if you have an individual scientist carrying it so far, I don't know or an individual team, I don't know if it gets all the way there. And then even if you did, you got to learn how to program it and make use of all this stuff with some very different kinds of models where it's pragmatic for the rest of our lives. And I think that takes a long time to get that started too. So.
I mean, I think the high line is I agree that the computing will move beyond the transistor. I think there will be other kinds of computing paradigms. I think that's what's going to be part of what will keep Moore's law going, right, as a function. I think the primary negative vote is just that the acceleration past Moore's law is such an amazing acceleration, which would be stunning. Lots of things that would be unobvious would come about. You've already got it. Moore's law itself already is already kind of increasing the speed of acceleration and change past 14 to 16 years already in terms of what it's happening. And so to go faster than that, compounding over time,
It's mind-bending.
It's mind-bending. And so it's like I'm a believer in if you'd said, look, this is how Moore's law continues, then I would have been green, but otherwise uncertain.
Oh, yeah, I should clarify. Moore's law, the way Gordon Moore would have defined it, which is transistors and that. This 110-year version, exactly, is greater than that. So what he was observing is kind of like a piecewise linear thing on the curve that, yes, the SIA and all the industry association was like, let's build to this. But if you go back 110 years, no one was on a roadmap. No one knew where they were on a curve. The 110-year curve transcends Moore's law. It's across all technology substrates, and no one knew they were fitting or planning to that curve. So, in a way, we've been misled by Moore's law to think that had anything to do with transistors.
Is that an investable trend, though?
Heck, I don't know. I think it's sort of maybe like a religious leap of faith among the technorati that, it's not going to come to some end and the parties sort of go home and, the advances of progress somehow come to a halt, right? It used to be no one knew about progress about 200 years ago, and then like scientific method, and people got excited like the future might be better than the past, and Moore's law is emblematic of accelerating change. It's mind-bending. It's almost cosmological. And like, why do ideas compound over time, and why does technology accelerate, and will it continue forever, and if so, why? So I think it's more of a profound philosophical question. Investability, sure. It would be investing in molecular electronics and the next wave of post-silicon technologies, which IBM, Intel, and everyone else, of course, is doing as well. So, to your point, there are startups, there are big companies. It'll probably be a little company later you haven't heard of that overturns the existing order, just like every other cycle with mini computers and mainframes and so on.
Okay. Time to vote. Looks,
Can't hold up to.
It's an optimist.
Sure you can.
If you can't sell
It's
that
quantum.
story, this room. Yes, it's a one and a zero.
Right. There is, or you just kind of.
It's oscillating, right? Okay, so this it looks like 50, 56, 44. So a little bit on the optimism side.
Yeah, the Intel table is all red over there. Like, screw that. Yeah.
Well, we just hope they'll think that it's still linear for another decade. Or else we should short Silicon Valley real estate.
Right. That would be the investable trend, is to buy real estate here, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, last trend. It's always dangerous to give Peter the last word, but we're going to do it. The beginnings of bioinformatics, intelligent design over random drug discovery. Meaning, more powerful computers will turn biology into an information science.
Let's see. I think there's sort of both a negative and a positive aspect of this. So the negative aspect is that the existing pharma approaches are really at a dead end, and it's worth underscoring how you are basically at a dead end, where and it's basically been you test millions of different drugs, you see what shows some promise, you then do more detailed tests on several tens of thousands, several thousands, and you sort of have this funnel. And as the decades have progressed, there sort of are fewer and fewer interesting drugs that this sort of random search process is able to turn up. There are about a third as many drugs currently in the last stages of FDA being approved on an annual basis by the FDA as there were 15 years ago. And sort of the big pharma companies are going to lose about 30 to 80% of their revenues in the next 3 to 5 years as these drugs roll off, and there sort of is nothing to replace them. So you need a very different model for it. I think if there is going to be a future in biotech, it has to be something like a much more targeted, informationally driven approach. I think the challenge is that it's very complicated, and there's a question whether there's enough richness to the information to make it happen. But I think there are a number of indications that trends like this are close to getting started. I think the genomics piece was very much overhyped for much of the last decade, but we see a number of companies where people are starting to apply it in very interesting ways. I think I think it's going to become possible to use computational power to sort of more accurately model drugs. You can sort of do sort of 3D protein shapes, various things like that, and figure out what some promising targets are. The search problem, the random search problem is too big. The search space is simply too big to do it randomly, and so you need to have some ability to bring to bear computational power. And I think we're going to start seeing this over the next decade. There's a nanotech version of this as well. I'm just focusing on the biotech one.
Panel, you just want to take that to a vote? Greens.
Woohoo.
Yeah.
We have a
Green.
winner.
We want more drugs.
Yeah.
Better drugs.
No, I love.
Bing wants them gamified, but
Well, there will be. What's A/B testing but a big game? So,
I love this trend because I think we're on the cusp of something really grand in this whole area where people talk about intelligent design a lot. Someone's got to actually start doing it. And it's not only design, as you say, computationally, which is quite amazing. For the first time, actually, in the last few months, David Baker's lab up in Washington showed that you could computationally design a novel drug that has binding effect on a real therapeutic, and in this case targeting an invariant protein on the surface coat of H1N1 virus. And so you can't normally evolve for this, you can't normally design for this, and he engaged 250,000 computers to, for the first time, build and then create like 100,000 variants and actually create a viable product that's now been licensed to pharma. So it's just happened, the first known instance of this. So there's that design side, which with Moore's law gets easier and easier. So what it took 250,000 computers last year will take less and less. So that's a good sign when you're on the cusp of something, an investable theme off of Moore's law. The other area, though, that's kind of interesting to me is design for evolvability, which is not doing intelligent design, understanding the complex systems of human health and what have you, but design an organism that then evolves to do what you want, right? By selectively crippling all of its other actions. I'm thinking about algae and bacteria and stuff like that to make fuels and chemicals. And there's been a lot of progress there, exceeding human intelligence, where you design things you don't fully understand. And that whole methodology of how we build the future is also very powerful, whether we call it intelligent design or not. It's certainly upon us and is underway in many of the companies we're aware of. And so I think we're entering this brand new area where we're re-engineering the information systems of biology. And the systems complexity of humans is not yet available to us and won't be for a few years, but certainly microbes are, and drugs that target specific things, specific proteins and catalytic enzymes, things of that sort. So I'm big green.
Yeah, I think this is aggregation of, I think there's Moore's law continuing and or accelerating. I think that there is the ability to read genetics, mapping a genome individually and the group. That's the kind of data trend earlier. I think there's ability to construct unique things, right, across, that fit for different folks. And so I just, all of those trends, like a number of the trends that we've been talking about this evening, this is actually, I think, one of the corollaries that goes in with the trend. So I think it's
like the culmination.
Yeah, it's along the vector of biology, maybe also nanotech, which Peter didn't go into, but I think it's true.
A leading indicator of the rise of gamification was actually the first internet crash, as I say the first, which caused American universities to lose all their computer science majors. And 60 of them decided they needed to teach game design classes, which for a while in the first part of the first decade were the only computer science classes that were overflowing. And the interesting thing about bioinformatics is it's a great way to get a new building for a university from dead people, and it's probably the only way to get females into computer science classes. So I think that is a leading indicator that universities are trying to make this happen.
Well, there's gamification to get genders in the CS as well.
How far away, Peter, do you think we are from seeing commercially available products emerge from that trend?
Well, I think the question is how well they're going to work. So, the FDA tends to be very tough on a lot of these things, but if you can get things that are dramatically better, I think you could possibly get them through an expedited process, and you might see things within 5 years.
Right, and there's a couple of supporting trends that, like over the last 10 years, the cost to sequence and the cost to synthesize the DNA, the code of life, is dropping much faster than Moore's law itself. So, what used to cost, billions of dollars is now going quickly from 1,000 to 1,000. So it's a whole human genome sequence. And then the, synthesis of DNA, building it from the ground up with no animals involved, just kind of like an organic printer, if you will, is dropping even more quickly still. And so you can produce millions, perhaps billions of experiments per day. So in that idea of, sort of design for high throughput experimentation, you can do things that were just unfathomable just 2 or 3 years ago.
And the ability to model the human systems in silico I'm sure it's gotten a lot better in the last 5 years, so you can avoid phase 1, phase 2, and avoid killing a lot of mice and rats and monkeys.
Yeah, they're pretty expendable.
The FDA would never let that happen.
Yeah, then we get to the technocracy. Yeah.
You short big pharma?
Well, being long technocracy only means that it's not going to get less hostile to technology.
Did you short big pharma then?
Does that mean it's more hostile?
Sorry, it's going to get. It was a triple, but anyway.
So if you short it, then right. But you want to long it, so you want to.
Anyway,
I got to back that in it. Yeah.
Sounds like go long baby mice.
Go long baby mice. I'm not sure where you get the where you do that.
If you make the baby mice, not if you are a baby mice.
Right.
Okay.
We'll throw it out to a vote. You guys were following all that. Wow.
Oh, Jesus.
Sea of green.
Wow, there's like
This
only
will
like
test-
3 people here who don't like it.
This will test the twit poll arbitrage once and for all.
We're going to live,
Oh my God,
we're gonna
look at
live
that.
long enough to have electric cars.
No way. Is there something wrong with the
I like
software?
your electric cars better.
0.
It's a shutout.
Wait.
Wow.
That's pretty amazing. So that one person on
It's
Twitter.
that Pfizer table, over there.
Tim Lincecum
Wow.
pitching for the
That's
bioinformatics.
how can that be? I mean, I believe this trend, but 100 to nothing. Wow. Okay. So we're now going to.
I have more doubts about whether I should invest in it. The sort of the contrarian.
I know
thing
it seems
makes me
like
nervous
it's
as an
now
investor.
now you have to go against the grain, right? They have to short the companies who might be doing this. Right?
No, I won't do that.
Both the red states and the green states believe in intelligent design.
But would you? So just wanted to follow up on this question though. So do you short big pharma, or are they going to get it and figure it out, or go buy the company that's doing it?
I don't think they're going to get it. I think that basically, I think there's sort of points where really big companies are so sclerotic that it becomes almost impossible for things to change. And they're probably set up in all the wrong ways. You have these sort of monopoly profit streams from these drugs that have sort of screwed up all the cultures inside these companies. And I think the challenge for the next generation of biotech companies is going to be to somehow figure out ways for their own cultures not to get screwed up by the 17-year monopoly streams you get. And at the end of the 17 years, you have forgotten how to do anything new.
What location do you think will be the hub of bioinformatics? Will it be the Valley? Will it be Boston? Will it be Beijing or Shanghai?
Go ahead.
This is still a plausible place from a computer-driven perspective. I sort of doubt Boston is going to ever come back. Shanghai is
Lost it at
more
Thanksgiving.
promising if you need to create alternatives to the FDA.
Yeah, it's historically been La Jolla, South San Francisco, and now Shanghai. I mean, it's through the roof. They have more gene sequencing, equipment there than anywhere else. But it used to be very concentrated in a few zip codes. I mean, just La Jolla area in South San Francisco.
I wonder whether, if you end up with a regulatory barrier that prevents this becoming the center of that activity, or whether, say, the Chinese, for example, end up dominating because they rip out some of the regulatory barriers allowing this.
Ironically, they're a technocracy. More engineers than lawyers in government.
What did you say, John?
Ironically, given the China comments, they're a bit more of a technocracy already than we are, with more engineers than lawyers in government.
And I do think this is one of the places where you can screw it up by regulation. I think you have to be very careful about, it is a global, I think the trend is globalized, so I think it will happen, and the real question is where. Or how many places, in fact.
Another weird, ironic twist is that you want to co-evolve with your technologies. The more you sequester them, right? Not only is it the old argument that they get into bad hands, but you also don't co-evolve with the artifacts of your creation, and so the chance of catastrophic outcomes actually goes up if you try to segregate it from human interaction.
Back to a previous discussion, do we think bioinformatics disruptions are going to happen by 20-year-olds? Or is it going to be 38 to 45-year-olds?
That's Kevin's thesis.
Oh, is that?
12-year-olds, current 12-year-olds, I think.
Are going to do.
Well, look at the iGEM competition. It's teenagers that
They're going to be self-taught bioinformatics.
They're called biobricks, and they build them like Lego blocks. They've made all kinds of interesting stuff.
If the biotech stuff works, it won't matter because you'll be able to take pills to make it
Be 12
no
again.
different.
I try to act like I'm 12.
It'll probably happen in industrial applications before it happens. We start ingesting this stuff, whether it's fuels or oil spill remediation or, fabric coatings, that kind of thing.
What will happen is the 19-year-old, the guy's 12 now, not when he invents it, but the 19-year-old will take something that should be in the purview of scientists with PhDs and government-funded research and realize that there's a way to do this that sounds preposterous to all of us, that you can actually do it inside your house and do it quite cheaply on cheap equipment in ways that we never thought possible. And that I do predict something like that will happen. I don't know if it'll be bioinformatics, but it'll be whatever that's what it always is.
The Heath kit, sheep cloning kit.
You might be. Clone their dog.
Eric, we should probably recap, run
Yeah.
down.
Went on vacation. All I got
So what was your favorite trend?
Legos.
Wow.
Oh, are we ready?
Well,
Oh, so we'll go through the. All right.
Right now, if you thought this was a good session, hold up green. If you thought it sucked, hold up red.
There you go. No one's
Those who
doing
hold
that.
up red don't get invited next year.
and it's kind of like
Except for Accenture, which has bought all these tables.
it's kind of like the Oscar ballot, where you want the George Clooney to win Best Actor, but the French guy ends up winning it because he's the odds-on favorite, and you got to vote for him. But I'd kind of like Bing's zero marginal cost of education, because I want that to happen so much more than the other ones. I want there to be better, cheaper, more inspiring education out there. I think teachers should be removed from that just information delivery, which is dull and deadening, into inspiration, and let the rest of the stuff happen through better adaptive learning tools, tablets, whatever the technology can deliver. That would be my vote for number one.
Yeah, I think I love the sensor trend, which I think is already happening and is going to be everywhere and is almost hard to deny. And particularly if we get tricorders, because I want a tricorder. But the real Star Trek trend, the real one that really gets my blood going is Steve's let's go beyond Moore's law trend, because if that's true, everything changes. And if that's true, then all the trends we're talking about today are not thinking big enough. So I hope you're right. I think we all hope you're right. So we're going to have a slide that's going to show the top 10 in order popular trends. Here they come. The trend standings. Number 10 trend: all vehicles go electric. Being the number 10 trend out of 10 is a dubious distinction, but at least you're in the top 10. So there you go. Number 9, a shift toward technocracy. Peter, they didn't like your trend. Moving on. Number 8, gamification of everything.
Including top 10 trends.
Including top 10 trends. Number 7, it's just the venture cycle. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Moore's law accelerates beyond. There's my favorite trend. At number 6. Here we come, the top 5. Radical globalization of social commerce.
That's a come from behind victory right there.
A come from behind victory, exactly. Number 4, the new hardware, bits to atoms. Wow. Everybody's going to have a 3D printer. Number 3, zero marginal cost.
Education.
Education, that's the trend. Massive sensors, there's my favorite trend, number 2. Mm-hmm. And the winner is? Number 1, bioinformatics, the last trend.
See? Peter?
The last shall be first.
Vindication?
And as George W. Bush said, you know, come back in 100 years and see how I did as a president.
I don't think you need 100 years.
Well,
Well,
let's vote again in 5.
We'll vote again next year, I think, actually.
That'd be good.
Thank everyone. This has been a great panel. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks again to all of our speakers. I want to thank Kevin, Bing, Reed, Steve, Peter, and of course Eric and Bruce for putting on a great panel. As a small token of appreciation, we have Churchill Club bowler hats for the entire panelists. I'd also like to again thank our co-host, Forbes, and our sponsors, SRI and Nuance. This is going to be a great picture in a second here with all of them wearing bowler hats. Thanks again. Thanks again for all of you for coming tonight. You've been a great audience. I hope you learned something and look forward to seeing you again in the future.